Welcome, everyone. It's good to be with you. If you are listening on the podcast today, it's a joy to be here and to share this time with you. If you're on the podcast, like I say, you probably don't notice much different or anything special other than that we're going through 1 Corinthians chapter 11, starting that today. But if you're on YouTube, you may notice there's no video. So some obligations with ministry and other personal concerns and things going on. I wasn't able to get that out in time to get all that edited and all that done. And so we're going to just go classic with audio. Intend to have that back, but appreciate your patience with that. We've been able to do that basically every week for the last 2 years, which has really been a great run on that, and hope to be back, if not next week, the week after that, and if not the week after that, surely the week after that, and if not that, definitely the week after that. So looking forward to being back in that. So don't have any intentions of stopping that part of it. Just want to get through this and through this section here and continue the content going. So appreciate your patience. We've got a lot to cover. 1 Corinthians chapter 11 has been taking a lot of study for me, a lot of time spent on it, and a lot of things I have to say. So we're going to dive right in there. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 1 through 3. Be imitators of me, just as I also am of Christ. Now I praise you because you remember me in everything and hold firmly to the traditions, just as I handed them down to you. But I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of a woman, and God is the head of Christ. Today's text starts a new chapter, and with that, we want to take a few moments to review where we've been throughout the letter. After a short opening and encouragement, Paul calls the Corinthians to unity. But it's a unity that must be founded on truth, the centrality of Christ Jesus. The primary foundational issue where they need to be unified that this pops up in is the gospel itself. The death and resurrection of Christ are the central historical facts of Christianity. Without them, the whole thing falls apart. The rub is that these truths were viewed as weakness and foolishness to the Jews and Gentiles, respectively. And so it appears in the Corinthian context, they had tried to distance themselves from Christ's death and resurrection, and even Christ himself, because of the offense to the people around them. To replace this, they'd been filing in behind various gospel workers, such as Paul, Apollos, Peter, and others. This created fissure lines in the church at Corinth around these favorite gospel preachers. Paul tells them that Christ alone must be the object and standard of faith. Far from Christ's death and resurrection being weak and foolish, it's the fundamental demonstration of God's power and wisdom in the world, and so he's worthy of all. And gospel workers, they have no inherent value apart from their connection and being laborers for him and through him. With this proper perspective of Christ's supremacy, Paul then turns to shorter sections addressing various issues within the Corinthian church. These really serve as vignettes of practical theology. They're the application of the truth of Christ's singularity, sufficiency, supremacy, and superiority to all the world and over all the world and all that it has to offer. And these truths shown here are critical, really, that Paul's been going through in the last 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 chapters. They move us from spiritual infancy and understanding to maturity. They include the need for holiness in the body, lawsuits and personal rights, sexual sin, divorce, marriage, seeking the good of others, idolatry, renouncing personal liberty, and navigating the complexity of a world filled with sin in a way that honors God and serves Christians and non-Christians. Very complex issues. With that, we come to our text today, where Paul begins with a bit of a summary of the last section, which we'll look at our first supporting point, and then we'll move on to the rest of the context here in the first half of 1 Corinthians 11, in our big idea today, which is understand headship. Understand headship. Our supporting ideas are, number 1, imitate Christ. Number 2, honor authority. And number 3, husbands are heads. Imitate Christ, honor authority, and husbands are heads. Imitate, honor, and head. Paul begins this chapter with a call to imitate him just as he imitates Christ. If you have a Bible with paragraph headings, they're effectively unanimous in placing this material with chapter 11. Paul is calling the Corinthians to imitate him in the way that he imitates Christ, specifically on the issue of food offered to idols, but also just more generally. In short, Paul's going to go to any lengths to make sure the gospel is primary and people are not distracted from focusing on it and living for Christ in their personal lives, living lives of holiness and good works. While eating in idols' temples is categorically wrong, Paul is interested in the shaping of them to have the heart of Christ that works in self-denial for the good of others. And that's so why he spent so much time on that. And that's what he wants them to imitate, is his heart of self-denial that imitates the heart of self-denial that was in Christ Jesus and all that he did. With this, Paul has a subject change. In the NASB, the English word is now. The Greek word, it's a preposition, is de, spelled D-E in English, or translated D-E in English. And because of its usage elsewhere, I've compelled that it serves as a bit of a section delimiter in the same way we would use chapter marks or paragraph spacings or indentions. And so what is he doing here? Well, he's praising them he's changing subject slightly. He's praising them for holding fast to the traditions he gave. And there are two major interpretive kinks in this and how we do this. And I'll just tell you, as we go on through the next several verses, there are just interpretive challenges on interpretive challenges on interpretive challenges. So bear with me in that. The first two we've got here in verse number 2. First, these traditions that they're holding fast to and that they're holding firmly to, that they're remembering. What are they? Jesus uses this word of traditions extensively to describe the traditions of people in Matthew chapter 15 and its parallel in Mark chapter 7. In Jesus' usage, the traditions are subservient to the will of God. Even if they might otherwise have value, they should not be raised up as equal with direct commands of God. Paul uses it similarly in Colossians and Galatians. However, in 2 Thessalonians, Paul commands some collections of traditions to be kept under the authority of Christ. So which type are these? Well, it's hard to say. Is it a sin to keep them, or should they give way to other principles? We'll come back to that. Second, what is meant by this in everything you hold firm to the traditions? One notable rub about this is that they've disregarded Paul's instructions that could certainly be regarded as a capital T tradition around the Lord's Supper. You can read that here in just a few verses, and the general dysfunction of the church. So it doesn't seem like they've actually been keeping these traditions very well. But I think it makes the most sense because he's about to contrast this, in verse number 3, he'll start with the word but. He's about to contrast these traditions that they hold firm to with creation and the order of the Trinity, and they're not actually keeping a lot of the actual things he told them to do. So I think it makes the most sense that these are traditions as practices and prescriptions that Paul instructed them on how to do things, but doing them differently would not have inherently constituted sin. They weren't necessarily a matter of faith. And so they've got an affection for Paul, and they're doing things the way that Paul's got the choice how he might like for them to be done. But these things might be something like, just to give you an example, like order of services, service times, seating arrangements. These are things that fall outside of Christian law, although, as he'll go on to say, the way you conduct your assemblies and honoring the poor could be it, but just in principle, it's not necessarily. So coming to verse number 3, we'll spend our next 2 points here because we're about to get to more interpretive challenges. Verse number 3 serves as the interpretive key for the entire passage that follows, and so it's important that we spend some time here. Paul begins with a contrast, saying that Christ is the head of every man, the man is the head of a woman, and God is the head of Christ. First, we want to understand what's meant by this word head. We need to take some time on that and be patient. The Greek word for head here is kephale. I'll use that a little bit. And in modern scholarship, particularly egalitarian scholarship, it has become vogue to say that in these contexts and other contexts like Ephesians 5, the word head here means something like source. This is usually argued on the basis of it being used to refer to head as the head of a river, and we use that in English. They use that in Greek. It's a source of that. And in Paul's day, they'll say things like the medical regard for understanding and decision-making wasn't in the head, it was in the abdomen. We've got phrases still today like a punch in the gut or a gut feeling, or in the King James Version, bowels of mercy that indicate that sort of thing. All right, a few things to that. I don't want to misrepresent that, but I've only got a few minutes. So if you want more details on what's being said and a more fair treatment, I'm glad to share that with you. But in short, the medical evidence there is greatly overstated, frankly, if not misrepresented. While it's true that the belly and the heart were thought to be the seat of emotions, it was certainly thought that the mind was the location of the decision-making, the directing, and the regulation, in much the same way that we distinguish between the heart and the mind today. So it's not that different. There's sort of this appeal to difference that's just not quite true. So they did think of the head as the place where decision-making happened. Further, kephale is used extensively in the Bible to talk about authority. For instance, in Colossians, where Jesus is said to be the head of all authority, I believe that's also in Ephesians 1. And the only time it definitively has the notion of source or provider in view in the context at all is in Ephesians 4, where Christ, the head from whom the whole body joined and fit together by whatever joint supplies, that context there. In that sense, it makes sense to read that Christ having authority over the church, as has already been said in Ephesians 1 and will go on to be said in Ephesians chapter 5, that means he has a responsibility for the church and thus provides for the church. And so there's never this sense in which, like, well, it can't be authority. It only has to be source. The sources things seem to be derivative of the authority and responsibility language. Furthermore, the Septuagint never uses it to mean source. Early Christians used the word to mean authority when they read that. Early Greek-speaking Christians, they read it to mean authority, and the lexicons are essentially unanimous here. You have to really go with minority opinions, and it's even worse than that. So, all that to say, the reading of Kephale here, head, to mean source, is contrived. And I want to say that with respect, but we need to be honest about what's going on there. It's not a good reading. It doesn't work linguistically, historically, textually, or medically. It doesn't work there. And I just want to suggest charitably that likely it's a case where this passage does have meaning for gender dynamics, and it seems that those meanings are contrived to try to avoid that. So we have to step back honestly and try to figure out what's going on there and why. For the final point, which is taking some good time, but appreciate your patience, we want to look at the meanings and dynamics outlined in the passage so that we can speak with the utmost clarity. Paul says that Christ is head, that is the authority over every man. And the man is the head, that is the authority over a woman, and that God is the head, that is the authority over Christ. Now, there's three major questions that we want to look at. There's more we could ask, and I'd love those in a question and response. But the first is what is meant by man. The second is what is meant by woman. And third, how is God the head of Christ? Really, the first and second questions go together. And you might say man and woman are just male and female, likely adult male and females. However, in Greek, there's no distinction for the word man and husband. It's the same word. Similarly, wife and woman, they're the same word. You just have to determine it from the context. And so there's an interpretive question here. Does Paul mean man and woman, or does he mean husband and wife, potentially in this case? Further complicating this issue is that in English, the word man is actually used to refer to all humans regardless of gender, although it's now becoming much more common to refer to mankind or humans or people more generally because of that confusion. Regardless, that still exists in English usage. All right, so it seems pretty clear that Christ being the head of every man means that Christ is the authority over every male. It seems pretty clear because he's going to use that phrase in the next verse about every man who has something on his head, and then verse 5, but every woman who has her head uncovered. So there seems to be this contrast here. When he uses this phrase, every man, it means every male in that sense there. All right, so then what about here with this woman here? Whenever it talks about the head of, or the man is the head of a woman. Since he changes from every man to the man, singular, and he does not say every woman, but a woman, this seems to align and pull the marriage relationship into view, a la Ephesians 5. As it pertains to authority and headship, he's just saying the fact that every man is under the authority of Christ, and every wife is under the headship, the authority of their husband. Paul is certainly not arguing that there should be a chauvinistic patriarchal structure in the sense that any man can boss any woman around, or that only men should be leaders in any setting at all, or women are forbidden from being authority over men in a general sense. That's not what he's arguing. He's arguing specifically to the marital relationship. But that said, he is definitively saying that that is how God has structured the relationship between husbands and wives. Again, you can look at Ephesians 5 for more information on that. How this will play out in the coming episodes extends beyond husband and wives, but that presumption is the backbone of what Paul is doing in this scenario. So as we wrap up, this is obviously super offensive for our world today. But I think the relationship of father to son and God being the head of Christ gives us a framework to think about this and to understand this. Notice Paul says God is the head, that is the authority over Christ. Jesus repeatedly declares that he has come to do the will of the Father, not his own. Further, chapter 15 will tell us that Christ will deliver the kingdom back to God, and there's similar language in Philippians chapter 2. As we think about what Christ is calling our sisters into, he's not calling them to do something he himself was unwilling to do, but that he himself did towards God. Further, Christ participates in the divine identity and is not inferior to his Father on the level of essence. Likewise, Christ talks about the Father and his existing and pre-existing eternal love that they have one for another. The Father's love compels the Son's obedience, which is born out of his love for the Father itself. The distinction between Father and Son in this case is one of function and role and dynamic, not one of essence, worth, or value. This is not saying that women are inferior to men. This is not saying that men are better than women. This is saying that within the marriage relationship, God has ordained this structure that he's also modeled and been willing to put in place in other places and even himself step into in the person of Christ. For more on this and a lot of the dynamics, there's more nuance and there's more structure here. Go check out our content on Ephesians 5:22. I believe it goes through 23, 5:22 through 23. You can see that. That's only on the podcast side, but listen to those to give you more structure and more understanding as we try to deal with this countercultural reality of headship and authority, but not headship and authority that's born out of abuse or power, but love and service towards one another. So as we think on this, husbands, are you submitting to the lordship of Jesus Christ? Are you primarily, singularly, and obsessively focused on being obedient to his direction at all times? Do you expect your wife to do something you're not willing to do yourself? That is, do you expect her to submit to your headship when you refuse to submit to the headship of Christ? As Christ provides for you and cares for you, do you provide for your wife and serve your wife? Do you love your wife? Do you make following your headship a pleasant thing, or is it a burdensome thing? Wives, as you consider yourself, are you submitting in the way that Christ submits to God? Are you submitting in the way that husbands are called to submit to Christ? Do you set aside your concerns for that and out of his love reflect love towards one another so that you might reflect the will of Christ and the service of Christ? Thank you so much for joining us today here at 15 Minutes and a Big Idea. Today's big idea: understand headship.